From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, and we're going to begin the program today with probably a misquote of Rahm Emanuel from about 7 years ago, when confronted with the fact that his good friend Hillary Clinton and his good friend Barack Obama were running against each other. Reporters kept saying to him, "So whose side are you on? Who are you supporting in this?" And if I recall, he said, "I'm going to be spending the next few weeks hiding under my desk." And I am having my own personal hiding under the desk moment here right now. You're getting to watch it right here on Chicago Newsroom. We have talked many times on this program about tax increment finance. Don't tune away. Stick with us here. We have talked about tax increment financing in the past, and generally speaking, the voice of that has been a voice of protest led by the venerable Ben Joravsky, but there have been plenty of other people on the program. And it also happens that at the same time, a very good old friend of mine, somebody I met 23, 24 years ago or something, when we were working at the Department of Environment, is a woman who went on to become nothing less than the director of the Office of Budget and Management for Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And Alex Holt, also, I believe you have the title, right? The longest lived budget director or whatever it is in modern Chicago history.
Well, as far back as we can find. Maybe I'm the only one who wants to take the punishment.
And I mean, that's an amazing thought right there, just that alone, that you've been able to do this for so long. And it's got to be just about the most stressful job in city government. And I admire the hell out of you for the fact that you've been able to do it for so long. And I acknowledge, ladies and gentlemen, from the beginning that I'm in the presence of someone who is a heck of a lot smarter than I am. So, Alex, here's what happened. I was at one of those weird meetings, those open house meetings that you guys had on the budget, the three of you. The three of them. And I was there, and I saw you afterward, went over to say hi, and you said something to the effect that I'm aware of your show, and I think you guys have been putting out some inaccuracies, and I think that you ought to have me come in and correct them. That's fair. Anyway, yes, we said, of course. And so what happened is, on Monday, I was invited to your office, and we spent an hour going over all of these numbers and charts. And I am not someone who really completely understands these things, but I did come away with a different understanding than I had had before, and said, let's get on the air and let's talk about this, and we'll see if we can begin to figure out TIFs and where their values are. And I think it's important to say that you said, if you want to have a debate about the merits of TIF, let's have that debate. But
I think we need to have it based on facts and numbers that are accurate, and I think there's been a lot of information out there about how TIF is spent and the purposes of TIF that don't fairly and accurately represent TIF, and don't represent in particular the community investments that come from TIF. And so I think we should have the argument, if we want to argue about policy around TIFs and whether they're the right economic development tool or not, that's one thing. But we ought to do it from a basis where everybody understands what the facts are about them.
I do want to just say one other quick aside before we dive into that it's a kind of a weird situation, because we have an opportunity to have you on TV for half an hour, and you're obviously a very highly sought after person right now. We're in the middle of this major budget reveal that's happening, and we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about something completely different. But I think it's really important to do this, because TIF financing is a crucial piece of the way we run the city these days in many ways. And it's a great thing to be able to sit back and just talk about this one thing and not talk about the Department of Streets and Sanitation or police or whatever else is out there. So that's why we're doing this today, in case you're thinking, why isn't he asking her about McCarthy or something like that? The funding, okay, let's do this. Give me the quick one-sentence definition of what a TIF is.
One sentence?
Yeah, two sentences.
Okay,
You can have three.
I might take 3 or 4 if that's okay. So TIF is basically TIF is property taxes. It is property taxes that are generated from a particular geographic area, and those property taxes have to be spent within that geographic area, and they're intended to, and the expenditures are supposed to drive both community investment, so roads, lighting, bridges, libraries, as well as economic development. The revenues created by the growth in the community, and once the TIF has done its job, then the TIF goes away, and the theory is that you'll have a community that's been reinvested in and revitalized over time.
And this is not a brand new thing. TIFs have been around since the 50s, I understand, right? And not in Chicago, but it's not a new idea.
No, it's not a new idea. In Chicago, they've been around since the early 90s.
And the concept, again, is that you freeze, first of all, you define an area.
Yeah.
You say this is an area that is in need of this service. It's a blighted area, or it's
in need of conservation.
Which means we think it might be declining.
Yes,
we want
that's
to.
right.
We want to save it. Okay, so then somebody sets up the parameters. The city council votes on it, and from that day forward, the tax collection in that district is frozen at that level at that day.
Well, let's step back. So what happens within that geographic area is the property values of the property value is frozen, right? They set a base property value. What's the property value in the TIF today? All of the property value that's in the TIF today, when those people pay their property taxes against that property value, that will continue to go to the local taxing districts. However, the theory is as you invest in that community, you're going to increase property values, right? You put new lights, new streets, you put new libraries in, you put a new job, a new business in that generates jobs, then property value in that community grows. As the value grows, the taxes against that value, those are then put back into the TIF to continue that cycle of reinvestment. It doesn't mean that the local taxing districts get less, but it does mean that the growth, the taxes against the growth in that TIF are dedicated towards reinvestment in that community.
Okay, all right. Now, you were kind enough to draw me a couple of little drawings. So I asked the prop department here at CAN TV if they could come up with a magic board for us. And here it is. If you feel at any point you feel inspired that you want to draw something, but you did draw for me these kind of rectangles that show here's what a TIF district would look like, or here's what a district looks like without a TIF.
Yeah.
Here are a couple of different examples of TIFs, because we have TIFs in a lot of different kinds of communities in Chicago.
Yes, we
some
do.
very rich communities and some very poor communities, and they function very differently, and their results are different,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right. So do you want me to draw you?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
All right.
let's do
so
it. You
you
show
have to
it.
pardon my terrible handwriting,
No,
though,
that's
Ken.
fine, that's
So
fine.
let's think about the concept that we were just talking about with a TIF, right? So if I'm going to do this. This is the base value. This is the property value in this particular TIF, okay? That was there on the day that the TIF was created.
On the day the TIF was created.
And let's say that it's $100 worth of value. That's
Okay.
obviously too low, right? But and then this will be taxed. I'm going to make up a tax rate. I'm going to say that the tax rate is 10%. Okay? Then that means that there's $10 worth of money that's going to the taxing districts. Okay? Now let's pretend that there's growth in that TIF, and because there's been a lot of jobs, a lot of new investment, that the value in the TIF has doubled, right? And so now we've got $100, but that $100 up here is taxed at the same tax rate, but the $10, right, so if this is times 10%, if that $10 is then going to go into the TIF, and then it has to be spent back in that community in that TIF, right? Now, if you think about it, though, if you think about another area that's got the same $200 worth of that's got the same value, right? So instead of being 100 base and 100 TIF, it has $200 worth of just base value. This is the area that's right here that's not in a TIF, okay? It's paying the same amount of money. It's the same 10%, which gives you $20 worth of taxes. It's just here the taxes are divided differently. Part of it goes back into the community, part of it goes to the local taxing bodies. Here it all goes to the local taxing bodies.
So in this case, the $20 goes to the taxing bodies. In the other case, $10 is reserved and put back into that TIF.
That's right.
Okay. Are we done with this? Can I put this back on the floor? All right. So this is the question that comes out of this for me. the tax is reserved into the TIF here, but in this case it is not. And this raises for me this, I was thinking about this after I talked to you the other day and came up with this very weird, and you may find it inappropriate, but the bathtub analogy, okay? I've created in my mind this magic bathtub. You'd really like it. It's kind of a clawfoot. It's, you know, it's a really nice, it's a beautiful vintage bathtub.
Yeah, like vintage.
When it is filled to the top, so there's not one more drop in it, it represents all of the taxes that have been asked for by the various governments. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because when we think about it, we just think it's, you know, the money just going to the city. Well, it's not. A bunch of the taxes, most of it, in fact, goes to CPS. Some of it goes to the city's corporate fund, which is your baby. And then there's a whole bunch of other things. You know, I don't know what they all are.
Parks, water reclamation district, city colleges.
So when we pay when I pay $1 in my property taxes, my dollar is being split all different sorts of ways. So, do you have any sense, do you just give or take $1 billion about how much last year, let's say, all these governments together asked for from the taxpayers?
They asked for about $4.5 billion.
That's it? It was $4.5 billion total?
Yeah, that's correct.
Including the city and CPS?
And the county, yes.
It was only $4.5 billion? Okay, all right. So now, how many tax increment finance districts are there right now?
They're currently 147, but we're proposing to terminate 2, so in 2016 there'll be 145.
145. And do you know how much money they generated to put into the TIF funds last year? How much did they generate?
So in 2015 they're going to generate about $360 million.
Okay, so about a third of $1 billion. I mean, now I'm trying to do math in my head, which isn't working. But okay, all right. Back to my bathtub. My bathtub holds 4.5 billion drops of water, or whatever, however you want to do this analogy. But it holds all of that money. Okay. Now, the TIF. A TIF that's taking that $100 out or whatever it is, somebody's coming and they're dipping $100 worth out of that bathtub, aren't they?
No, they're not. So that bathtub that you're thinking about, right? So I'll talk about it as the property tax levy,
right,
about the money that's going to the various taxing bodies. About half of 52% goes to schools. City gets about 18% of it, and the rest of it goes to all the other taxing districts. That money, we get what we ask for. So if we all ask for $4.5 billion, we get $4.5 billion. Whether TIFs exist or TIFs don't exist, we still get the same amount of money. And not only do we get the same amount of money, but it doesn't change the amount that an individual is paying. So for example, if I've got a $250,000 home and I'm located in a TIF, or I have a $250,000 home and I'm not located in the TIF, I'm going to pay the same amount of taxes. It's just a matter of whether my taxes go to the local district completely, or whether part of them go into the TIF to be reinvested in my community. But none of that changes the amount of money that the local governments receive.
So if I have a $250,000 house in Portage Park, and I'm paying X number of dollars for my taxes, and I also own a $250,000 bungalow at, say, 32 North LaSalle, in the middle, right in the middle of right next to that big building there. I got my little bungalow, my garage and everything. I'm going to pay the same tax there as I'm paying up in Portage Park. But if I pay $4,000, let's say, in taxes, which would be pretty good for LaSalle Street, but if I pay that $4,000, about what, a lot of it is going into the TIF in that case, my house on LaSalle Street, right?
Well, it could in some TIFs. In the case of LaSalle Street, the difference between that TIF was created when the property values were really high downtown, and so there's actually very little value, relatively speaking, that's going into the TIF in that case. Actually, most of the taxes that are collected on LaSalle Street are actually going to pay for.
So I just came up with a bad example.
But yes, you're right. There's
Some theoretical, there are TIF districts where 3/4 of the money that's collected goes into the TIF, right?
So let's think about the near south TIF, which doesn't exist anymore. It just expired, right? It's the South Loop area. That community has changed enormously over the 24 years that that TIF was in place. Most of the taxes that were collected from that property, because of all the growth in that neighborhood, did go into that TIF. But as you note, the $250,000 home in LaSalle Street, right, is paying the same amount of taxes as that $250,000 home, say in Pullman or Portage Park or Little Village. They're all paying the same amount of taxes. It's just a matter of whether their taxes all go to the taxing body or whether their taxes, a portion of their taxes, goes to support neighborhood investment.
Okay.
But again, none of that changes the amount of money that the local governments get. We have a fixed levy. We ask for a certain amount of money. We get that amount of money.
That's a really critical point. When the school system says we need whatever it is, I don't know, there must have been about $2 billion, right? It must have been. So the school system says we need you to give us $2 billion, and by law we're going to get it from you. And then the government, the I guess treasurer's office and assessors, their job is to figure out a way to apportion this to everybody so everybody pays their share of it. Here's the question, though, that does take me back to the bathtub. When you say that we have to come up with $4 billion, about half a third of a billion, whatever it is not taken out of it, but is allocated differently. And we all have to make up that third of a billion, right? So in my analogy, it's not so much that somebody's coming from the TIF and dipping into the bathtub and taking it away, but the bathtub didn't quite fill because some of that money went there. So we all have to take our little shot glasses and throw a few extra pennies into the bathtub to fill it up. So we are, as individuals, paying for the TIF program. It's just that it's a very subtle difference. I would put it to you this way. Let me put it to you a different way. I pay about $4,000 a year in property taxes, okay? If you killed all the TIFs tomorrow, my tax bill next year would not be quite $4,000. It might be $3,920 or something, but it would go down a little if everything else changed. If nothing else changed, my tax bill would go down a little bit. I do pay a little bit more because there's a TIF program.
That's true, you do. But you pay truly a little bit more. It's not like it's...
Like I said, it's the shot glass.
Yeah, it's not as if it's hundreds of dollars worth of value, hundreds of dollars worth of difference. It really is, in your bathtub analogy, a shot glass, maybe even a thimble, depending on what the structure looks like. There's really when you think about the overall property value in the city, there's about $64 billion worth of value that gets taxed against, and that goes into to the local taxing districts. There's about $6 billion worth of value in the TIFs, so you can see it's a very small proportion of the overall property value in the city of Chicago. Okay.
So the amount that I might be paying on my $4,000, and I'll get off of this now, but the amount I might be paying on my $4,000 is $100 or something?
I don't even think it's that big.
It's hard to say,
yeah.
but it's, okay.
Part of the problem, Ken, is, and I think this is one of the reasons that TIFs can be really complicated, is that we have a complicated property tax system.
Absolutely.
And so you have to understand the basics of the property tax system with EAVs and AVs and equalizers and all that stuff.
The answer to your question, Ken, is it depends.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be that big. I think it's a much smaller amount.
The reason that I'm hammering this is because this is sort of the Staten Madison of the criticism of the program. We constantly hear that it is a hidden tax, and the argument that we get back from the city is, no, it's not a hidden tax. It's right there on your tax document. You can see it, but in fact, it is. If it's not hidden, it's just something that's kind of behind the scenes that but you know what? I'm going to drop it there because
But you know what, Ken? Here's the thing. That's no different than, say, the homeowner exemption that you and I receive, or the exemption that we give to low-income seniors, or the landmark exemptions that we give to certain businesses, or the industrial exemptions. I mean, there's a whole series of things that are built into the property tax system that take your and my taxes up. But there's a reason for them and a broader policy goal. And, frankly, I don't live in a TIF, but, from my perspective, the incremental amount more, the very infinitesimal amount more that I'm paying to make sure that we were able to bring the method plant into the Pullman neighborhood, I think is a good community investment that I benefit from.
The conclusion I've reached after listening carefully to you and after years and years of being involved in these conversations is that it is a flawed system that does a lot of good. I mean, it's almost Churchillian, it's sort of like, it's whatever that would be. It's like, it's the worst of all possible ways of doing this except for all of the others. I mean,
I don't know. You can take that point of view. I'm not sure I would go quite that far, but
well,
I do think
you better not. You're the budget director. But so that no. What I want to say is that you have made some very good points about the projects that have been done with TIF money that could not have been done any other way. And you won't say this, but I will. We live in an environment where our federal government and our state government have completely abdicated their responsibilities to cities. They just don't care about cities. The federal government's agenda is nothing more than making sure we spend more money on the military and seeing if we can get abortion clinics closed. And beyond that, they don't really have much to do. And we have a governor who was just elected who on almost his first day said, I'm going to cut revenue sharing to the cities. I'm just going to eliminate it. So cities are in very many ways on their own. They've got to try to figure out some way to repair school buildings, to replace streetlights. Again, the list could go on for the rest of the show. And this is not a perfect way to do it, but you have been able to use it to do some of these things. There's a different debate, a political debate that has nothing to do with all of these numbers. And it kind of gets to the heart of the concept of TIF financing is that it helps jumpstart the economies in stressed and distressed neighborhoods. And I think there's been some evidence that they, not just in Chicago, but just generally, they're not really terribly successful at that. They can be successful, but they're not overwhelmingly successful. And it looks to me like, a lot of that's happened in Chicago too. A lot of the smaller TIFs in the smaller neighborhoods that are just completely distressed haven't generated any money into their TIFs, and they've had to be put down. So that might be the reason. You and I can't even speculate on this, but that might be the reason why Mayor Daley decided, okay, we're going to start TIFing LaSalle Street. We're going to start TIFing where the money is, and they got money, and they were able to do a lot of really cool things with that money, but it's not exactly.
Well, I can't really speak to the decisions that were made by the prior administration.
And believe me, I'm not attempting to have you do that.
I know you're not, but and as I say, there are good and bad reasons why people have done things. They were in a particular position at that point in time. It may not be the decision I would make. Thinking about LaSalle Street, there's a conservation argument there about at least at the time that it was TIF'd, the quality of the office space and needing to try to actually have LaSalle Street be kind of high-end as opposed to Class C office space. That's changed. I think that argument's changed over time. We're back from an office lease perspective. We're back to vacancy rates that were, pre-recession. So we have very little office vacancy downtown.
Because they turned them all into hotels. That's why. That's another story. I'll never understand that. But
I think you've got to think about, people really do focus on those central area TIFs. They focus on what's happening downtown, but they also have to look at a couple of things. First, you've got to look at when many of those, setting LaSalle Central aside, and also that central area TIF that had been created. You have to look at when those TIFs were created. Most of those ones that are near north and near south and near west were all created back in the 90s. Near north, near south, and near west were very different communities in the 90s than they are today. There's been a lot of development in those communities, which you can argue has been good or bad depending on your perspective. I think it's a good thing for the city, good thing for those communities.
I do too. I think development is good.
But those are a limited share of our TIFs. Right? There's a few of them, there are a number of them in the downtown area. Most of our TIFs are neighborhood TIFs. And most of the TIFs, the money in those TIFs is being used for things like neighborhood economic development and all the infrastructure I talked about in schools. We put an enormous amount of TIF money into schools. But I do understand the sensibility about thinking about those, central area TIFs, because now, given all the growth in the area, they generate a lot of money. It's one of the reasons that the mayor announced a freeze in those TIFs. We're freezing 7 downtown TIFs. Anything that we haven't booked project-wise except for emergency infrastructure work, that money's all being surplused and that money's all being returned to the taxing districts.
Yes, I really do understand that, and I think it's important to say that when we talked the other day, I brought up the issue of, for example, the schools. I mean, one of the criticisms goes something like this. Think about what the schools could have done with all that money that has been robbed from them over the last 10 or 15 years from the TIF program. We wouldn't be needing the TIF program to go in there and replace the windows and stuff like that if they just had the money from the beginning.
Well, guess what? They're property tax capped. They can't raise their property taxes to equal the value of the dollars that have come out of the TIF. This is one of these things about the nature of our property tax system. And CPS can't just raise their property taxes. So if you hadn't put that value in the TIFs, they couldn't have necessarily captured it. There's some small cases in which they could, but most of the value that you've seen is growth in value on existing properties. They're not able to capture that because state law says they can't. So you need to think about that factor and know that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to pull those dollars in, and they wouldn't have been able to invest them in, say, art teachers or gym teachers or the things that they have been investing in with the surplus that they've received over the last 4 years. The other thing is that there is a capital need at CPS, significant capital needs. We've got both, overcrowding in some schools. We've got other schools with roof issues. We've got other schools that need ADA accessible bathrooms for kids that go to the school. And those are things that TIF invests in and actually provides CPS with an additional source of revenue to make those repairs.
You said that something like $1 billion has been invested in?
$1.2 billion.
$1.2 billion over what period of time?
Since most of it's been within the last 10 years, and there's still more commitments and investments that are made in CPS every year.
So an argument can be made, and I think I've heard you make it, that in essence, TIF has kind of by default become a sort of a secondary capital budget for the school, not budget, but a capital service for the schools. I mean, capital redevelopment or repairs.
Yeah, it's definitely a source of capital funding for CPS. It's a source of capital funding for the city. It's a source of capital funding for the parks. All of those things augmenting the cities and the parks and CPS's regular capital budget. For the city, it's a little different. We're not property tax capped in the same way that CPS is. So theoretically, if TIFs hadn't existed, we would have been able to capture all that growth over time. But it's not something, when you look at somebody like CPS, not something they would have been able to do.
We talked briefly about, I know I was using the example that you guys have used of the what I would call the McCormick Place L-stop. I mean, this is an example of something that has been needed since 1964. There's a train line 3 or 4 blocks away from McCormick Place, but you can't get to McCormick Place on the L system. It's been something that's been needed for 40 years. It was just constructed using largely TIF money, and it's a great service to the city. And it's one of those things that you have to say that this is the benefit side of having this TIF money. Now, of course, we could do another whole show on how is it exactly that you can find money to do these big projects in various parts of the city where they don't appear to be in TIF districts. I mean, I don't know. Was that in
Yeah,
it?
It's in a TIF district, and that
And it
station
raised all that money?
Yeah.
That TIF raised
Yeah.
that money for that station?
Yeah, then there's a concentration of TIFs right there that have benefited from a lot from the changes that have happened in the South Loop area. And the fact is that station was almost completely funded with TIF.
We're really running out of time here, but the other important point that I want to make is that I have joked many times on this show, and I mean, I'll come clean with you. People have talked to us on the show, and they say something about TIFs, and I don't understand how TIFs work. And I say, well, it's so easy to understand how TIFs work. A bunch of money is given to the mayor, and he keeps it in his drawer here. And when he needs $1 million, he just reaches in and gives it to whoever he wants to give it to. I don't think, even after all of this, I don't think that's far off from the way it really works. The real issue is, and you do not have to respond to that.
I'm going to say I disagree with you, Ken. Go ahead.
The real issue, though, is that, you know what? It's not a terrible thing, because he is the chief executive and he is elected for that purpose. The problem, this is where the politics part really gets hot. And this, again, these are beyond your purview as the budget director, but when the chief executive makes what the public perceives to be boneheaded decisions with that money, it gives TIFs a really bad name.
So
You've seen that happen.
Well, yes, but your statement presumes that there's no community input and involvement in those TIF decisions. It presumes that the alderman has nothing to say about it. It presumes that the alderman has had no conversations with the community. It assumes that the planning department, particularly when it comes to economic development, has had no conversations with the community. And it assumes that our transportation department, for example, doesn't have a point of view about the investments that need to be made in communities. And it presumes that it doesn't sit within a larger planning context, right? It's just this idea that you take $1 million out and you hand it to somebody. That's, having been involved in this now for 4.5 years, I've got to say that's really not the case. And I'll say it more strongly, really not the case. And so, what often happens though is people from outside that particular community look at the investment that's made in that community and say, well, I wouldn't do that. I want that money. I would do it differently. But remember, TIF is about local investment. And so that community where the investment has occurred may have something to say about where that investment should occur that somebody who, for example, lives in my neighborhood might not understand and might not agree with, but it's not my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. It's not my it's not the investment that I've been involved in helping make the decisions on.
One of the, I would say, shortcomings, one of the flaws of the program, though, is that it does tend to be able to do these things in communities where there's an increment, where there has been a significant increment. If you're the Pullman TIF, you're not going to be getting a new L stop you're not going to be able to pull an L stop out of the TIF money because I don't know if they even raised any TIF money, right? So that's where the problem, that's the problem for you guys.
But there are ways you can, I would just as a side note, I won't get into the technicalities of it, but there are ways, even for a TIF that isn't generating a lot of money right now, you can structure things to bring in a business that will help drive increments. So when I talk about the method plant, that was a TIF that it's in a TIF that isn't generating a lot of money. But there are ways to structure it so that you bring it in, you bring a company in, you bring them into a piece of property that was previously vacant, wasn't generating any property taxes, and that particular business and that particular piece of property starts to pay property taxes into that TIF that you can actually then reinvest in the TIF.
Mm-hmm. We are pretty much out of time here, but there are a couple of issues that I have to bring up in order to be able to continue to do this show. Tom Tresser, who is one of the main activists against TIFs in Chicago, has asked you for an accounting of the nearly $1.4 billion that is, I don't know how to describe it, unspent, it's on hand, it's in banks somewhere, but it is, you say encumbered, they say if it is encumbered, give us a list, show us what it's encumbered for, and they say they have not been very successful in getting anything out of your office to describe exactly what those encumbrances are.
So, actually sat down with Tom a couple of weeks ago to walk him through where you can find the data.
He had one of these little sessions too.
We do post it all online. What we didn't used to post, the kind of pending projects, we've now changed the way that we do our reports over the last couple of years to put every project that's pending that still hasn't been completed or still hasn't been fully paid out. Part of the issue with TIF, and it's one of the things we've been working on, is that you put a project in place and it might take 5 or 6 years to complete that project, and during the completion phase you've got cash that's building up to make the payment when the project's done. We moved from bonding to a pay-go only
really?
with TIF,
okay.
Because there are a series of bonds against these TIFs, but values in TIFs go up and down too much, the revenue's too volatile, you don't want to bond against it, so we do pay-go only. You're right, there's $1.4 billion in cash sitting in the TIFs, or in a bank account someplace, right? Of that, about 1.3 is committed to projects. Almost all of those projects are community projects. There's $500 million in infrastructure, so lighting in streets and libraries and bridges. There's another $200 million that's going to schools. There's another $120 million that's going to affordable housing. Out of all that cash that we've got on hand, only about $12 million of it is dedicated to kind of downtown projects, or downtown economic development projects. The fact is that we do post all that information. I do recognize that it's not always the easiest thing to read because it's a lot of information. You have to go TIF by TIF, but it's also one of the reasons we put out this financial analysis each year in the summer, and we've got a whole TIF section in the financial analysis that tries to, as much as you can, explain to people in a really simple way how a TIF works and where all the money's been going and how the money's been spent.
Okay.
And I'll be happy to take you through all the data too, Ken.
All right. Okay. Well, we may just do that at some point. As I said to you in conclusion when we were meeting the other day, one of the things that I think has brought TIF into the public eye in a kind of negative way has been the public perception that a lot of these projects are sweetheart deals with developers and, the kind of thing that happened with McCormick Place with the basketball stadium and that sort of thing. And that is that intersection of economics and politics. But after all, we live in a political city, and politics is what drives everything.
But you also, in that case, it's hotel, not the arena.
Well, it was the arena, and then it became the hotel.
But I think you've got to remember that McCormick Place is an economic driver for the city. It provides a lot of jobs. It brings a lot of people into the city. It brings a lot of tax dollars into the city from its convention business. And so there is a decision there, an economic development decision, that the investment in the hotel actually helps further that economic development and that economic growth in the city, and that it's an investment that should be made for the health of the city as a whole. You can disagree with that decision, but you can't discount it. You can't really discount the reasons that the decision's been made and the growth that that's going to help drive.
Do you think, in conclusion, that Mayor Emanuel has a different approach to the use of TIF than had been in the past?
I don't know if it's. I guess I don't know enough about the Daley administration's approach to TIF and how they made the decisions that they made.
You mentioned his name.
But I do think, from the mayor's perspective, he is very focused on a couple of things. One, he's very focused on economic development, but he's focused on economic development as a whole across the city and not just in the downtown area, and really thinking about whether you agree with the grocery store in Englewood or not, about bringing as many resources to communities as you can. And then also using those dollars focused on those community investments that I talked about, and in particular in schools, and making sure that we've got safe, clean, well-lit schools that aren't overcrowded, and anywhere we can find the money, and if TIF's available to us, we ought to take that money and we ought to make that investment because it actually matters to the people who live in that community.
You've said that that the Whole Foods in Englewood has actually already spurred some other people to come and look at investing in.
Yes, it has. There are a number of other retail opportunities that are looking to and are actually in the process of signing some deals with our planning department to come into that area, really because of the Whole Foods and because of the growth that's happened there. And of course, that used to be a fabulous retail street, and so it'd really be great to see that happen again. Yeah,
and that's one of the doubling back down weird ironies of all of this, is that one of the things that TIFs do is they stimulate public conversation about things. So you have the Whole Foods thing, and of course there's the immediate, what? Whole Foods in Englewood, what is that? And then that creates a kind of a secondary level of, well, wait a minute, we want that in our neighborhood too. And then that maybe gets developers looking at it to say, hey, maybe I've been overlooking this, maybe this is something I should do. So in a way, TIFs actually kind of stimulate a public conversation, or they can. Alex, you've been very generous with your time, thank you very much. We ran a little over time, but hey. That's the way it goes. Thank you very much, and I hope maybe we'll talk to you another time about other things.
Okay,
but,
all right,
I
thanks,
always
Ken.
enjoy having you on the show. It's really great for you to do this, and I mean, it's the little show. It's really wonderful for you to come and spend some time with us. Thank you.
More than happy to do it. Thank you.
Alex Holt is the Director of the Office of Budget and Management at the City of Chicago, and I'm Ken Davis. And if you want to, comment on this, you know how to do it. You can reach us. You can watch this show anytime you want on CAN TV. Just watch this address right here. You can go and you can watch us on demand anytime you want. You can also visit us at chicagonewsroom.org for transcripts and all kinds of other stuff. And I hope you'll do that. We'll be back next week with another show right here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for watching. Bye.